So, Lone Rider here. And as a cyclist, I was watching an interesting video the other day. This was by a cyclist in England, and he put it up. It was very simple. It was he was riding down the street, and there was a pedestrian who stepped out in front of him carelessly at a corner without looking up from her cell phone. And he basically said, put that thing down and pay attention. It could be a bus next time or something like that. And that was it. It was very short. It was like a little public service announcement type thing, I guess. And, we've all seen this type of thing where somebody's careless behind the wheel, on foot, whatever, either because they're just an asshat or because they're drunk or because they're on a cell phone. I think if you asked most people, they'd say this is a problem. They might disagree as to the extent of the problem it is, but I think most people would say it doesn't add anything. There's not a question of whether or not it's good or bad. It's bad. It's just a question of how bad is it, right? And the funny thing is, yet those same people often end up blindly defending the careless pedestrian or the careless driver, as the case may be, especially if the other party is a cyclist. And I've seen this before here in the States. Seeing it in this brief PSA from a cyclist in England is not a surprise. But it does, there's a couple things they bring up in the comments. Virtually all the comments were negative against the cyclist and defending the careless pedestrian, as well as the like and dislike thing. And I got to wonder, why is that? Like, how are there that many people out there who really think that it's okay to do what this person did and that it's not a dumb idea, that it's not unsafe? Or do they really think that you should just be able to march into the street without looking up and that the world should stop for you? And I think if you look at some of the really spacious arguments they came up with to try and defend the pedestrian, one of them was that they just flat out called the guy racist. Apparently the pedestrian was like Asian or something. I didn't remember. I was thinking mostly like careless pedestrian. I wasn't really paying attention to the race. But apparently the pedestrian was Asian or something, and the one person says, "Oh, how you must hate Asian people. You're a racist." What? No, the guy didn't say anything in the video about her ethnicity or her race. All he said was about what she was doing, namely not being careful. I mean, like, seriously, like, what the hell's... That person's clearly reaching, right? There are issues where race is something that, I could see bringing up where it may be relevant. Being a dumbass and throwing yourself into traffic like a flying squirrel and the resulting altercation that occurs isn't one of them. Sorry. And then there were people who said, "Oh, the cyclist is rude. Well, why do you have to be so rude to this poor woman?" One person even said, "Oh, he harassed her." And it's like, he's harassing this innocent person. Why doesn't he leave her alone? No, I'm sorry. If you nearly cause a crash for somebody because you're wrecked, if you run a stop sign and somebody else has to slam on their brakes, they're entitled to tell you off, okay? If you step out in the street and there's a near miss, somebody's entitled to tell you off. The difference is, in this case, this guy didn't tell her off. All he said was, "Put that thing down and watch where you're going." And then he added, "It could be a bus next time," indicating that he had at least as much concern for the pedestrian's own safety as his own. Now, here's the funny part. People start nitpicking on that and saying, "Well, but there are no buses allowed on that street, so what's the point of that comment?" Now you're just illustrating that if this is what you really believe, that you're just completely concrete bound and incapable of thinking conceptually, okay? The whole point is that this isn't a single isolated incident that has to do with nothing in the world except for this one spot in England. The whole point is that this is a widespread pattern of misbehavior, probably in the life of this pedestrian and definitely in the lives of many other people. At the very least, if she was this clueless at this particular intersection, somehow I doubt that this is the only time she's ever done that. Been looking at her phone and stepped out in the street. So when he says next time it could be a bus, he doesn't mean if this exact same thing played out in this exact same street corner. He means the next time she's ever out in public. Why? Because this is how a lot of these people conduct themselves. They don't learn their lesson. The danger with that is that they'll keep doing this until one day they do hurt somebody or they do cause a bad crash. And after that, they may genuinely feel bad, but it's too late. Feeling bad after the fact doesn't excuse that you were an asshole your whole life and it was leading up to setting somebody up to get sent to the hospital or the morgue. And we really do need a big social push to crack down on this behavior and curtail it. Rules and social customs and even laws are all fine and dandy, but they all start with the idea that the acceptability of the behavior changes at a cultural level before it ever gets to the point of, there being a law or a social convention. And the problem with that is that for that to happen, people have to realize that it's wrong, right? Look what we did with drunk driving when we had a big problem with that. We still do, but it's not as widespread as it was. Why? Because we cracked down on it. We not only had stricter enforcement and stricter penalties, but we engaged in a cultural campaign to literally try and convince people to change their acceptance of it, that it wasn't just one of those things you did, but that it was actually morally revolting because of the harm that it risked to other people. We need to do the same thing with cell phones. And public service announcements, like this guy putting this video up there, basically saying to the world, don't be like that person, is a start. So I don't know why everybody was so against it. Literally, to the last, almost all the comments and everything were about defending the careless behavior of the pedestrian and denouncing the cyclist. And again, I don't think they were really defending her. I think they were defending her by denouncing him, which is telling. Because if what she really did was really wrong, really there was nothing wrong with it, you would expect somebody to say, well, there's nothing wrong with stepping out in the street without looking. But although that's what these people are essentially saying, they never say it that directly. What they instead do is they try to say that by denouncing criticism of it. So rather than trying to defend stepping in the street without looking, they denounce the various criticisms of stepping in the street without looking and attempt to accomplish the same thing by default. So they'll say, oh, the cyclist was mean, the cyclist was harassing this poor woman, the cyclist was this, the cyclist was that. Yeah, what about the person who caused the whole thing? The pedestrian on the cell phone. Let's talk about her. Nope. Too busy denouncing the guy whose only crime is to point out that this is careless and nearly be hit by this person. And again, they're really reaching. Oh, there's no buses on that street. That's not the point, right? There's you're racist because the person that nearly hit you was Asian and you complained about them. What? Like, are you hopped up on goofballs? Does anybody even think that way? Then there's the, right of way means you can just throw yourself in the street and everything will magically stop like a force field. That's not what it means. Right of way means that if the pedestrian is crossing the street, pedestrians have the right of way. It means that if they're in the act of crossing, any traffic who comes upon them and the situation they've created by crossing has to react to that situation appropriately, in this case by slowing down. Now here's the thing. That's different than entering a traffic situation that's already there by throwing yourself in the street like a flying squirrel without warning. And even if you were going to argue that the cyclist should have somehow, like you can't argue that the cyclist should have stopped according to right of way unless you misunderstand what right of way means. But even if you go with the misunderstanding and that somehow he should have stopped, how is he going to do that? He stopped when this did ultimately happen, and he ended up stopped across her line of travel, right in front of her. Which means if he hadn't beeped his horn right before he started, as he was slamming on his brakes, they probably would have hit each other. Because he beeped the horn, she was brought up short by being startled by the horn, and then they ended up right there in front of each other. And this happens this happened to me on my bike once. I was riding to the bike shop on a Friday, and there was somebody in Scotch Plains, and it was coming down the street, and he's coming towards me, and I'm going this way, and the car makes a left turn across my path, and I slam on the brakes as soon as I see it coming. That they're actually gonna turn in front of oncoming traffic, namely me. I slam on my brakes, and the bike goes into a skid, just barely misses it, and ends up doing like a 360 over here before coming to a stop. The car slams on its brakes. By that time, it's already through its turn, so we stopped here. I'm here on the bike, car's here. Where we started was here. Now, this is what happens that gets interesting. The driver says to me, when I said, what are you doing? You nearly hit me. Don't you see this traffic coming? You don't turn across oncoming traffic. And the driver, of course, my heart's pounding. It's like, oh my God, it was close. I nearly got run over by this huge car. And then the driver is like, what's your problem? You were able to stop. The blind leading the blind. Yes, I was able to stop after I'd intersected with your line of travel. Which would mean what? If you had kept going and I had kept going, we would have hit each other. So I'm saying, well, but I mean, that's just it. These things happen at the last minute. They're called accidents. They're called emergencies because they happen, emergent at the last minute without warning. But it's usually due to somebody doing something wrong. In the case of the car with me, when I was on my bike, you're supposed to wait for oncoming traffic. You're not supposed to turn across oncoming traffic. In the case of the pedestrian, you're supposed to look before you cross the street. These are common sense things. Like stuff we teach to, 16-year-olds when they're getting the driver's permit, and the stuff we teach to toddlers as far as crossing the street's concerned. Don't we teach, like stop and look both ways to toddlers, for God's sake? Yeah. So this is something everybody should have learned by the time they were 5. We forget it as grown-ups for some reason. And as far as this thing with the right-of-way, okay, so if he started stopping when he did, which is when he saw that she wasn't going to stop and she was going to enter the roadway without looking up, he wouldn't have been able to come to a stop any quicker than he did. So that means if he had had that horn and beeped the horn and caused her to stop also, they would have hit each other. What does this mean? Even if he did try to stop, as soon as he saw that she was going to cross the street, they would still have hit each other, right? If he didn't beep that horn. So how does this work? Your interpretation of right of way, how does that work? Well, only if he can somehow magically predict what she's going to do. You see, normally pedestrians have the right of way. You see that somebody's either starting to cross or in the act of crossing. How would you do that? They would look, make sure the way is clear, and then step out in the street. It never arises that you're going to be right here when they step out in the street if they're looking and you're looking. Why? Because you're looking for somebody who's indicative that they're going to step out in the street. They're looking for traffic before they do so. So this sort of thing never happens with an issue where pedestrians really do have the right of way. Now, with an issue where pedestrians are throwing themselves into an existing traffic dynamic without looking, yes, this sort of near miss and sometimes even accident happens. But whose fault is it, right? Again, you're blaming a cyclist for responding to visual cues that he didn't receive, things like the pedestrian looking both ways and whatnot, because the pedestrian never engaged in them, because the pedestrian apparently wasn't aware that she'd come to a street, and needed to modify her behavior accordingly because there was now vehicular traffic in the mix, potentially. So, okay, suppose he really should have been able to stop in this situation. How would he know when to start stopping? That's the whole point. If he starts stopping when he started stopping and what actually happened, you end up with a collision or a near miss, depending whether or not he beeps the horn on his bike. If he started stopping further back, but why would he do that? There was no indication that the pedestrian was about to cross the street. She was just walking along a sidewalk. Why would you stop for somebody who was... that's the whole... You're blaming him for not reacting to visual cues he didn't receive because she didn't give them, because she wasn't aware there was an intersection there. Because she was looking at her cell phone. This is what people defend. And they reach so far to defend it. And they're almost so unanimous in their defense. And these aren't stupid people. I'm sure they're intelligent. But they're just so desperate to try and defend his behavior. And one of them even said, well, the cyclist was rude. Okay, so somebody else nearly caused an accident that could have had serious risk to your safety. You're being accused of mere rudeness. How does that balance out? How does one, cancel the other? Leaving aside the fact that what's rude depends a lot of times on circumstance. How you are entitled to respond to somebody who nearly injures you because they're being a moron and a dipshit is a lot different from how and what's considered appropriate when you're conversing with somebody, let's say, who wishes you good morning on the street, right? If somebody is walking by and they say good morning, it's appropriate to nod your head in response, to lift your hand in a wave, to say good morning back to them, to smile. It's appropriate to do all of these things. If you say, bah humbug, you bleepity bleep, it's not only not appropriate, the forcefulness in the way you're talking is just nasty, and there's no cause for it given that situation. So it becomes rude in that situation. However, if somebody runs a stop sign and nearly hits you, and you have to slam on your brakes and skid across 3 lanes of traffic trying to avoid them, and then the whole street is sitting there looking like something out of the last war, and you get out of your car and you're like, oh my God, that was close. And the person's looking at you with this startled look on your face, and you say something like, why didn't you see the stop sign, you fool? That would be rude if that's how you talk to somebody who wished you good morning on the street. But it's not rude in that circumstance, because you're not talking to somebody who just wishes you good morning on the street. You're talking to somebody whom you've already had a very negative interaction with due to a circumstance that they created where they put you in potential physical danger. It would be like if I was on the archery range And one of the other archers wasn't paying attention. Maybe he was on his cell phone or whatever, and a Bluetooth in his ear or something like that. And he shot his bow, and it nearly, hit me. And I had to, jump out, oh my God, that arrow went into, the wall right by where I'm standing. What's wrong with you? I would say something like, what the hell's wrong with you? You almost shot me, you dumbass. Why? Because I was nearly shot. I'm frightened. My adrenaline's running. But also, it's appropriate in that circumstance to have that level of forcefulness and reaction in your voice. Why? Because the other person was doing something that they had no need to do, that was in fact foolish and dangerous, and more importantly, not just dangerous to themselves, but dangerous to other people around, including yourself. So they literally just endangered your life and your physical safety and well-being. You are entitled to raise your voice in a situation like that. It is considered acceptable. It is not considered rude to raise your voice to somebody who nearly kills you. It would be considered rude to raise your voice to somebody who wishes you good morning or Merry Christmas, for example. Unbelievable. That I have to even explain this to somebody. That, what's considered rude varies depending on the circumstance and what the other person did, right? I mean, what would be considered rude when talking to a guy who broke in your home is a hell of a lot different than what would be considered rude when talking to somebody on the street. What would be considered rude when talking to a drunk or careless or cell phone-addled driver or pedestrian that nearly caused you to have an accident, whether by stepping out of the street or running a stop sign or what have you, is a hell of a lot different than what's considered rude when you're just talking to another person who's minding their own business. Very, very different. That I even have to explain this is saying a lot about these people. Again, I assume I give them credit for having intelligence and working brains. So why would they be making spurious arguments like this? Why would they be saying things? One went so far as to say, well, I have anxiety, and if somebody talked to me like that, I'd go home in tears. Words fail me. I mean, if that's the case, I feel bad for you. That's a problem. But acknowledge then that the situation of you going home in tears would be caused by you having a disproportionate reaction to somebody else reacting in a perfectly normal way to what you did, namely set up the situation where they were nearly caused to have an accident because of your reckless carelessness. And that's the whole thing. It comes back to the reckless carelessness of this person who didn't look up before entering the street, something we teach to 5-year-olds, but somehow grown adults don't remember. And that's why I think they're reaching so far to defend this, and doing so without specifically defending it. Notice none of these people said, it's perfectly all right to walk into the street like a zombie. It's perfectly all right to throw yourself into oncoming traffic. No, they defend that without defending it by attacking the criticisms of it. But their attacks on those criticisms are so spurious that you have to wonder, again, I have anxiety, and if somebody talked like that to me, I'd go home in tears. I'm not trying to be mean here, but so what? What does that have to do with the price of tea in China, right? I mean, what does that have to do with the fact that if you caused the situation that nearly led to an accident, that person's entitled to raise your voice? If you have some mental issue where you're going to respond to that in an unusual way, I'm sorry for you, but it doesn't change the fact that, generally speaking, what this person did, given the circumstance that the pedestrian put him in, was not rude. All he said was, put that damn thing down and pay attention. And, it could be a bus next time. I think he used a lot more restraint than most of us would when dealing with somebody who nearly caused an accident, whether by throwing themselves into the traffic like a flying squirrel or whether by, running a stop sign or being drunk or whatever. And that's the point. Just like being drunk, this cell phone behavior is a problem. And most people know it's a problem. So why are so many people defending it? Not only in this case, but in other instances that I've seen here in the States and other places, etc. It could just be they don't like cyclists and they see the cyclist as some kind of busybody. It could be they just, feel bad for the pedestrian lady. It could be they really don't understand all the concepts they're misstating, such as right-of-way and rudeness and circumstances and all of these things, to try and defend, without actually explicitly defending it, the conduct of the pedestrian. But I think at the end of the day, the issue why so many people would go to so many great lengths to indirectly defend indefensible, careless, and reckless conduct that pretty much everybody in the world agrees is a menace is because they engage in it themselves and they share that attitude. That attitude of, I have a right to go through life heedless of others. I have a right to, the world will stop for me. I'm the center of the universe. We have a term for people like that. Actually, we have many terms. Psychology has a whole lexicon. But, suffice it to say that that's not how the average person thinks or should be encouraged to think. And by defending this behavior, even if indirectly defending it by attacking the criticism of it in this instance, and many others, to be fair, what these people are doing is they're trying to normalize it. They're trying to basically be like, well, the pedestrian didn't do anything wrong. If you literally think stepping into traffic without looking and nearly causing a crash for everybody around, including yourself, is doing nothing wrong, then you need to seriously re-examine your basic premises. You need to seriously re-examine where you're coming from and where you're going. Okay, and you need to seriously think. If you really think there's nothing wrong with acting like that, at the very least you have to understand why other people aren't going to want people to act like that. And aren't going to want the view that there's nothing wrong with acting like that to be encouraged. Because it's dangerous to other people around you, and it's asinine, and it's just not something that should be encouraged. Right? We don't want people to be careless with guns, or with cars, or with anything to do with traffic interaction, including their own bodies, which, if somebody goes into the street, yes, directly their body can't hurt somebody inside a car. But what if that person swerves to avoid them and kills somebody else, or crashes into a post and injures themselves? What if I'm riding my bike and somebody jumps in the street, or somebody on a motorcycle is coming and somebody jumps in the street? On a motorcycle or a bicycle, you're not protected inside a car, right? So that person's body actually then becomes a potentially dangerous weapon against you. It becomes a living projectile. And the fact that people don't understand that this is a problem and needs to be addressed, when everybody kind of knows that it's a nuisance, I think when it was just a nuisance level, people were like, okay, no big deal. When it gets to the issue where you're seriously risking harm to people, then all of a sudden, now it gets real. Now we're not just talking about people in malls tripping in fountains. Now it's the real deal. People could die. So now people want to defend it. Why? Because when it was just about folks being absurd, they could laugh along with the rest of us. Person tripping in a fountain because they're a snooty person and not paying attention to where they're going and they think they're better than everybody else is amusing, right? It's the juxtaposition of results and reality with their delusion. Here's the thing. Somebody getting killed because somebody else is stupid and not paying attention, or somebody getting injured or having an accident or even just property damage because somebody else was stupid and not paying attention is not humorous. There's nothing humorous about manslaughter, okay? Or injuring people, or causing situations in which they could be injured. People who engage in this kind of behavior, whether behind the wheel or on foot, morally they're no different from a guy spinning around with a blindfold on while discharging a shotgun. Again, or somebody who's careless at the archery range and nearly shoots you because they're on their Bluetooth while stringing an arrow. What the hell is wrong with you? You don't do that, all right? But these people apparently do. And that's the only thing I can think of why there's such a hard defense of this. So many people going so out of their way to defend this behavior. It's not because they necessarily care about this pedestrian, but it's because in that pedestrian they see themselves. They see kindred spirit. They see somebody who acts like them, who's as heedless of others as they are, who has the same attitude, and maybe even who engages in the same reckless behavior. And they don't like the idea of being called out on it and told that their behavior has to change. They don't like the idea of being told that that's not acceptable. That going around hurting and endangering people just because you're too lazy to pay attention is not only not your God-given right, it makes you the bad guy, okay? And I understand nobody wants to be the bad guy. But if you are the bad guy because you're doing bad things, then you're the bad guy. Defending it just makes you look like an arrogant bad guy. And that's what these people are doing. I honestly think it's not because of the arguments that they put forth. They say, well, right of way means this when it doesn't, or he was rude when he wasn't. I don't think that's really what they're saying to defend this pedestrian by criticizing the cyclist who criticized the pedestrian's behavior. I don't think they really believe the specific arguments they're making. Some of them may, but I think it's just they're reaching for any straw or straw man that they can find in order to stave off a criticism of essentially their lifestyle. Think about it. Why would somebody be so... I mean, maybe they just really hate cyclists, so they figure, because a cyclist says it, we're going to disagree. Maybe. But what kind of pathological level of hate do you have to go to make such a big deal about that, right? Versus the interesting phenomenon and the tendency of some people's, some aspects of human nature, the tendencies are fascinating to me. And one of them is this tendency to basically twist words and say anything you can, even if it's gibberish or doesn't make any sense, or is flat out stupid, in order to try and justify a viewpoint that's near and dear to you. We all have this tendency, but when that viewpoint that's near and dear to you is the belief that you have the God-given right to go through life hurting other people by being careless, there's something wrong there, okay? But that's what I think leads to all of this. I think it's these people are defending the careless pedestrian and criticizing the person who's pointing out that it's careless because they're hoping to forestall a societal change in how we view, a cultural change in how we view their behavior. All right? Most people already agree that it's bad. The question is just how bad and what are we going to do about it? And I think these people are now, they've gotten used to, they've grown up with this, maybe through no fault of their own. Maybe it's just, that's what they grew up with, so that's what they see as normal. But the point is that at some point, you become a responsible, functioning adult, and you take responsibility for your own actions and for the harm you pose to others and the safety of yourself. These people don't want to do that. They want to go through life heedless of others, with blinders on, literally thinking that, they can do whatever they want and it doesn't matter. And if somebody else gets hurt, oh well, I'm special. Not only is that not a behavior that we want to encourage, God, could you imagine if any of these people had kids? What are they teaching their kids, right? This is an attitude and a behavior that we need to nip in the bud as a society. And how do we do that? Especially when we've got big, multi-billion-dollar cell phone and internet corporations trying to convince people to use their phone every minute of every day. Basically, trying to sell people, they're selling your time and your consciousness, right? To advertisers, to this, to that. And yes, you get something for it. You get a valuable service, but you're also losing your connection to the world. And the more you're into that phone, the less you're going to be aware that you're coming to an intersection and you might be about to cause an accident. So since everybody and their brother, despite token announcements in occasional newspaper articles or government groups or even watchdog groups pointing out the safety issues of people on cell phones while they're out and about, you also still have a very powerful lobby in terms of this billion-dollar industry here trying to convince you that this is the new normal. So how do people like us who are concerned about the safety implications of this and the changes taking place to our roadways, which are not for the better, how do we fight this? How do we try and, reinforce home the point that this is a bad thing and we shouldn't be encouraging it, we shouldn't be making it the new normal, that it's not normal, that it's wrong, it's dangerous. We start at the grassroots level. We don't have millions of dollars, right, like the cell phone companies do. But we got millions of people, right? Everybody who's affected by this crap. And yes, cell phones are useful and blah, blah, blah. But the point is that we shouldn't be sacrificing our public safety when we go out on the road for the convenience of somebody who's just an asshole, right? Unfortunately, it appears to be an assholes market. Everybody seems to be encouraging the assholes, and excuse my language here. It seems to be, everything saying to people, do this, it's okay. It's not okay. It's not okay to jump in the street without looking. We need to reinforce that idea. And this was a start. This was that start of the idea, well, we may not have millions of dollars, but we got millions of people. This was one person putting up a brief video clip as a public service announcement, basically just to say, be safe, don't do this. And the fact that everybody was able to have their own independent reaction to it, but the reaction that all the people who posted on the article, on the YouTube video had, were all to denounce the cyclist for pointing out this other person's careless behavior, rather than denouncing this person's careless behavior. Do you think the issue is really the various, straw man arguments and bogus arguments that these people attempt to raise and misstatements they attempt to make in order to do that? Or do you think the issue is really that they're also careless people or people who share that mindset and they don't like the fact that folks are calling out on it and they're trying to stave off a grassroots condemnation that could lead to a social and cultural change in how their behavior is viewed and a demand that they no longer endanger the rest of us on a daily basis? I think that's what it is. I think who would go out of their way to defend a careless drunk driver, except for maybe other careless drunk drivers, right? Who would go this out of their way to defend a careless person on a cell phone that nearly caused an accident, except maybe other people who are careless on cell phones or who share that attitude and find any criticism of it a threat to their essentially lifestyle? Just a thought, right? I mean, I honestly think that the video itself is relatively mundane. We've all seen close calls like that, and we've all seen reactions like that. Some of us have even been involved in them. What's more fascinating than this mundane video, which was, again, basically an attempted PSA, is the almost uniformity in the response that was so negative. And again, this is typical of any time you point out that somebody's doing something wrong behind the wheel or on foot, it's, oh, no, they didn't do anything wrong, but they never usually say it that way. They usually attack you for criticizing them. Oh, why couldn't you just stop? Why couldn't you avoid them? Why is it your business? Well, because you nearly caused me to have an accident. Of course it's my business now. Why would somebody go, so again, who defends a drunk driver? Other drunk drivers. Who defends somebody on a cell phone who's being careless? Other people on cell phones who are being careless or who share that attitude and that way of looking at the world. And my point is that that's not a good way of looking at the world, and it doesn't lead to improved safety. In fact, it leads to the opposite. It leads to situations like the very one described here. And the irony is that people are criticizing the cyclist for pointing out the pedestrian's negative conduct as if he's the one who prompted this whole thing. The entire incident was prompted by the pedestrian not paying attention and being distracted by a cell phone. So if you have a problem with anything that happened as a result of that, including the cyclist's tone or choice of words, you have a problem with the person talking on the cell phone. I mean, let's be clear. What caused what? What led to what? This is, a basic ability to think that I would have given these people credit for. But now I'm wondering how much their ability to think is being warped by their desire to preserve their mode of conduct, which is not a mode of conduct that we want to preserve in our country. It's a mode of conduct that we want to discourage. And, nobody should have to be put at a great risk of harm, physical harm, whether it's because somebody's drunk or somebody's talking on a cell phone or whatever, but because somebody's doing something they shouldn't because they're an asshole, all right? Your right to be an asshole stops where somebody else's safety begins. Lone Rider out.